June 14th, 2000. 7 in the morning. Across New York City, federal agents in windbreakers hit 30 separate locations at the same time. They're at apartments in Brooklyn. They're at brokerage offices in Manhattan. They're at homes on Long Island. They kick in doors. They execute search warrants. They place handcuffs on men in pajamas, on men in jogging suits, on men who look like accountants and men who look exactly like what they are. By the end of the day, 120 people are under arrest. 57 of them are stockbrokers. 11 of them are members or associates of organized crime. It is the largest single crackdown on securities fraud in American history, and it took the FBI 5 years to build. Frank Coppa wasn't just another mob guy who happened to wander into a brokerage office. He was a big man, broad, went by the name Big Frankie, a Bonanno family capo who the FBI's organized crime unit quietly credited with doing something no wise guy had ever done before him. He practically invented the pump and dump stock scheme. He brought the Mafia to Wall Street not as a side hustle, not as an accident. He brought it as a blueprint. And he spent nearly 30 years perfecting it before it finally swallowed him whole. Here's what gets me every single time I go back to this story. The mob was already dying by the 1990s. Rico had gutted the families. The old rackets were evaporating. The docks, the unions, the garbage routes, the construction kickbacks. The FBI had spent 2 decades learning exactly how that world operated and dismantling it piece by piece. And right when everyone assumed organized crime was finished, a handful of guys in Brooklyn looked at the booming stock market and said, "Why not that?" But here's what makes this story genuinely insane. Before Frank Coppa became the architect of the mob's Wall Street operation, he was a kid from the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn, selling stolen watches and furs off the back of hijacked trucks. Before that, a teenager hanging around the Marlborough House's public housing projects, learning which men to respect and which men to fear. Before that, a boy who had dropped out of college after a few months because the streets were more honest than any classroom. The whole story starts there, in Bensonhurst, with a kid who was smart enough to see exactly how the world worked and ambitious enough to work it. This is the story of how the Mafia stopped running the docks and started running trading floors. How 5 New York crime families, for the first time in their history, set aside their rivalries and sat at the same table to carve up a new market worth hundreds of millions of dollars. How ordinary American investors, people with retirement accounts and college funds and life savings, became the mark. And how a man who got his start selling stolen furs ended up as the first member of the Bonanno crime family in its entire history to break the oath of silence. But here's the question this story keeps circling back to. The moment the FBI finally got them, they had something that should have made a conviction easy. The tapes. Hours of recorded conversations. Mob guys on Wall Street, talking like mob guys always talked. So why did it take 5 more years, 3 more indictments, and a complete collapse of the Bonanno family from the inside out before the damage was truly done? You have to understand what 1990 looked like for organized crime in New York. The Gambino boss, Paul Castellano, was 5 years dead, shot in the street outside Sparks Steakhouse at 210 East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan. John Gotti had taken the Gambino throne and turned himself into a celebrity. The Lucchese family was coming apart at the seams. Federal prosecutors had been using RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, like a scalpel on the 5 families for almost a decade. They had maps. They had charts. They had informants embedded deep in the rank and file. The traditional rackets, the ones the mob had dominated for generations, were getting too dangerous, too surveilled, too expensive in terms of bodies and lawyers. Frank Coppa had seen all of this coming. He had been thinking about money in ways that most of his peers weren't. While other capos were still arguing over construction contracts and garbage routes, Coppa had been quietly nursing an idea that had its roots in something he'd done almost 20 years earlier. Back in the early 1970s, Coppa got his hands on a company called Tucker Drilling, nearly worthless. An oil drilling company with more debt than assets. He bought a stake in the stock for almost nothing. Then he went to work. He found brokers, actual licensed securities brokers, and he offered them something simple. He would pay them to push Tucker Drilling to their clients. Not recommend it, push it. Call after call, high-pressure tactics, a script designed to make a nothing company sound like a hidden gem. Brokers who played ball got paid. Brokers who didn't play ball got a visit. Not a legal notice, a visit. Here's the thing about that. In 1972, 1973, the idea of a mobster using the legitimate financial markets as a criminal tool was almost unthinkable to law enforcement. They were watching the docks, the numbers operations, the loan sharks. They were not watching penny stocks. And Copa understood that gap better than almost anyone alive. The Tucker Drilling scheme worked. The stock price ran up. Copa sold. The investors who bought in at the inflated price were left with worthless paper. In 1979, Copa was convicted for his role in the scam. But here's what got him through it. The laws weren't built for this yet. The sentences weren't calibrated. He walked out without a single day in prison. Which meant the lesson he took away from his first conviction wasn't, stop doing this. The lesson was, do it better. The Bonanno family had watched Copa earn. In 1977, the boss, Carmine Galante, personally inducted Frank Copa into the family. Wise guys got made for a lot of reasons. Usually it was loyalty, or muscle, or because you had blood on your hands that connected you to the family forever. Copa got made because he could make money in ways nobody else could imagine. And that, in the Bonanno family, counted for everything. Think about how old Copa is at this point. In his mid-30s, when he earns his button, most guys his age who grew up in Bensonhurst and ran numbers as teenagers either had prison records that were already destroying their lives, or they'd gotten out and were working honest jobs that paid almost nothing. Copa had a bus company. He had parking garage leases. He had vending machine contracts. And underneath all of it, he had something infinitely more valuable, a method. Now, this is where it gets interesting. By the early 1990s, the stock market itself had changed in ways that made Frank Copa's old playbook look conservative. The over-the-counter bulletin board market, where small companies traded in shares worth pennies, had exploded in size. Thousands of tiny companies, minimal regulatory oversight, brokers cold-calling strangers from phone lists. It was, if you had the right imagination, an almost perfect criminal infrastructure already waiting to be exploited. Copa went back to school. Not literally. But he plugged himself into the financial world with the same calculating patience he had always brought to criminal enterprise. From 1993 to 1996, he and his associates at the Bonanno family moved into two brokerage firms, White Rock Partners and its successor, State Street Capital Markets. These were not mob fronts in the old sense. These were licensed, operating securities dealers, and they were going to make the Bonanno family rich. Here's how it actually worked, step by step, because this is the part that most people skip over, and it's the part that explains everything. Step 1. Copa and his associates identified a target stock, a small company trading on the OTC bulletin board, something in the 50-cent range per share. They acquired a large position quietly, before anyone noticed. Step 2. The brokers at White Rock and State Street began calling clients, retail investors, ordinary people who trusted their broker. The pitch was confident, specific, breathless. This company is about to explode. We have inside information. Get in now before the price runs. None of it was true. Step 3. As more clients bought in, demand drove the price up. The stock that started at 50 cents began climbing to $1, to $2, to $5. Each uptick attracted more attention. More buyers, more momentum. Step 4. When the price peaked, Copa's people sold everything. Every share they held at 50 cents, liquidated at $5 or close to it, a 10-to-1 return. On a single stock cycle, the take could be in the millions. Step 5. The hype stopped. The brokers moved on to the next target. The stock price collapsed. The investors who bought in at $3, $4, $5 were left holding nearly worthless paper. Some lost their entire accounts. They got no warning. They got no call. Let's sit with the money for a second, because this is what made the operation so dangerously self-sustaining. Even a modest scheme, on a small company with a market cap under $10 million, could net $400,000 or $500,000 in pure profit over 8 to 10 weeks. Run 4 schemes a year, and you're clearing $2 million, tax-free, off the books. And because the victims were scattered across the country, because they had trusted a licensed broker, because the paper trail ran through legitimate financial institutions, the crime was extraordinarily difficult to even identify, let alone prosecute. And Copa wasn't operating alone. This is the detail that changes the entire scale of the story. By the mid-1990s, the concept he had pioneered had spread through all 5 New York crime families simultaneously. The Colombo family was running boiler rooms at multiple brokerage firms, scripting brokers like they were actors in a play. A Bonanno capo named Frank Lino, along with a Genovese captain named Rosario Gangi, had done something historic. They had jointly infiltrated a single brokerage firm called Myers, Pollock and Robbins. Bonanno and Genovese, together, in the same firm, using it as a joint criminal enterprise. Get this, the FBI had spent decades watching these families try to kill each other over territory and tribute. And now here they were, sitting in boardrooms, sharing brokerage commissions. Meanwhile, out in Lake Success on Long Island, a young broker named Jordan Belfort had opened a firm in 1989 called Stratton Oakmont. At its peak, Stratton had 1,378 employees working the phones at 1979 Marcus Avenue. Federal prosecutors would later establish that members of the Colombo and Gambino families had penetrated the firm. The mob brought in startup capital and enforcement muscle. Belfort and his brokers brought the legitimate-seeming structure, the securities licenses, the access to the markets. Together, the scheme ran for 7 years. Investigators calculated the total fraud at more than $200 million. The investors who lost that money were not wealthy sophisticates. They were people with retirement accounts. People who trusted someone on the phone because that person worked at a real licensed brokerage and sounded like they knew what they were talking about. In December of 1996, the National Association of Securities Dealers expelled Stratton Oakmont from membership, putting the firm out of business immediately. But by that point, the money was long gone. Here's what I keep coming back to with this particular chapter of the story. At the height of the operation, organized crime controlled approximately 24 licensed brokerage firms in the New York metropolitan area. Not fronts, not shell companies. Actual regulated securities dealers, with licenses and compliance officers and customer accounts. The Mafia hadn't just dipped a toe into Wall Street. It had bought real estate there. By the mid to late 1990s, the operation had grown so large and involved so many players from so many different families that the violence which had always been the mob's enforcement mechanism started surfacing in the most incongruous places imaginable. Listen to this. At a high-rise office in the financial district, inside a mob-controlled finance firm called DMN Investment Group on the 16th floor of 5 Hanover Square, a Gambino associate named James Labate is meeting with a stock promoter. The meeting doesn't go well. Labate cold-cocks the man, knocks him unconscious. Then he strips the shirt off the unconscious man's body to check for a recording wire in a brokerage office. At 16 stories above the street, that's where the Mafia had brought its methods. And there's a wiretap from around this same period. A Bonanno capo named Robert Lino, called Little Robert by the people around him, is on tape. Someone mentions an associate who came into the office, screaming and breaking things over money. Lino's response is recorded. "The next time that something happens, you can kill him," he says. Then in the same conversation, Lino is talking about informers. Someone asks what you do about people who cooperate with the government. Lino doesn't hesitate. What do you do when you have cancer? You go for chemotherapy. The enforcer next to him fills in the rest. You kill it. That tape is going to matter enormously very soon. But right now, the FBI is watching. They have been watching for years. And the case they're building has a name: Operation Uptick. The investigation runs for 5 years. The agents learn the architecture of the whole enterprise, which families control which firms, how the stock proceeds move through the system, which brokers are willing participants, and which ones have been threatened into compliance. By the spring of 2000, they have enough. More than enough. This is where the pressure starts closing in on Frank Coppa specifically. On March 3, 2000, federal prosecutors unseal an indictment charging Coppa and 18 others in connection with the White Rock scheme, the stocks they had manipulated, the brokers they had paid, the investors they had burned. The indictment covers activity from 1993 through 1996. Coppa is 60 years old. He has survived a car bombing. He has beaten one stock fraud conviction before. He believes he can survive this. He is wrong. June 14th, 2000, the day the whole structure comes down. 7 in the morning. FBI agents move simultaneously across New York City. The arrests are coordinated and fast. By 9 a.m., the count stands at 120 defendants. 57 are licensed stockbrokers. 11 are documented members or associates of organized crime, one from each of New York's 5 families. For the first time in the history of organized crime in America, all 5 New York families face federal charges for cooperating in a single criminal enterprise. Manhattan, U.S. Attorney Mary Jo White stands at a podium and describes what the government has found. She calls it a joint venture. All 5 families. One Wall Street operation. The documented fraud losses, more than $100 million. Investigators recovered wire recordings, financial records from 17 manipulated OTC stocks, brokerage account documents, and the floor recordings from inside the DMN offices at 5 Hanover Square. The indictment lists 25 counts, 120 names. In 2002, Frank Coppa is convicted on the stock fraud charges and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. He starts serving. And then, just months into that sentence, the government comes back with something new, a separate racketeering indictment, extortion charges. Evidence from a second set of recordings made by a Bonanno business associate named Barry Weinberg, who had quietly been working with the FBI while Coppa pressed him for payments. The new charges, stacked on top of the conviction he's already serving, point toward one conclusion. Coppa is going to die in prison. He makes a calculation, and that calculation changes the Bonanno family forever. In October of 2002, Frank Coppa becomes the first made member of the Bonanno crime family to flip in the family's entire history. Not an associate, not a fringe player, a made man, a capo. Someone who took the oath, who was present for initiations, who knew where every body was buried. The Bonanno family had, until that day, been the one New York family that had never had a sworn member break his oath. That distinction was now gone. Coppa testified against the boss of the family, Joey Massino. The government, in exchange, allowed him to keep $1.7 million in personal assets and a townhouse in Florida. Think about that sentence for a second. He kept $1.7 million, money earned from stock schemes built on the ruined accounts of ordinary investors. That was the deal. That was the math. The full weight of what Frank Coppa set in motion took years to finish falling. Joey Massino, the boss of the Bonanno family, faced his own federal trial in 2004. He had watched Coppa testify. He had counted the evidence against him. And then Joseph Massino did something no sitting boss of a New York crime family had ever done. He became a government witness himself. The boss flipped. It was, in the world of organized crime, essentially unthinkable. Coppa's decision had cracked the wall, and Massino walked through it. Robert Lino, the capo whose recorded voice had said the words that prosecutors would play for juries, was convicted on federal charges and sentenced to prison. Jordan Belfort, whose firm had been the visible face of the broader operation for millions of Americans who saw the movie but not the court transcripts, was indicted in 1999, pled guilty, and in 2003 received a 4-year sentence. He served 22 months. He was ordered to pay $110 million in restitution to his victims. Years later, he had paid back only a fraction of that. On September 13, 2000, Congress held hearings on organized crime's penetration of Wall Street. The FBI, the SEC, and state securities regulators testified. The Businessweek article that had first warned about the problem years earlier had estimated that 4 crime families and elements of the Russian mob controlled approximately 24 broker-dealers at the peak. Congress heard that number and didn't fully believe it. But it was real. The regulatory changes that followed were significant. New background check requirements for brokers, stricter oversight of the OTC bulletin board markets, enhanced licensing scrutiny for anyone seeking to own or operate a securities firm. The infrastructure the mob had exploited so efficiently was being rebuilt with better locks. And here's what I keep coming back to with this story. Frank Coppa was brilliant at what he did. Genuinely, frighteningly effective at reading a system and finding the crack in it that no one else had thought to look for. In another world, that intelligence runs a fund. It builds something real. In this world, it turned the retirement savings of ordinary Americans into a criminal revenue stream. And then it turned a mob family's loyalty structure into a pile of ash. That's not brilliance to admire. Its talent pointed in the worst possible direction, and the cost was borne entirely by people who never saw it coming. Frank Coppa died on October 17, 2023, in Sarasota, Florida. He was 82 years old. He was living under an assumed name. His death wasn't publicly reported until 2024. The man who practically invented the mob's Wall Street operation spent his final years in a Florida city under a name that wasn't his own. In a house paid for partly by money the government let him keep as the price of his cooperation. You could walk past him on the street and never know it. Just a quiet old man in a warm climate. Nothing visible to suggest that he had once sat at the intersection of organized crime and American financial markets and helped build a criminal enterprise that, at its peak, involved 5 crime families, 24 brokerage firms, hundreds of brokers, and more than $100 million in documented losses. The docks are still there, the unions still operate. But the men who once controlled those worlds figured out something in the 1990s that law enforcement is still wrestling with today. The most sophisticated criminal enterprises don't look like crime. They look like business. They wear suits. They have business cards. They file paperwork with the SEC. And when you understand that, you start looking at Wall Street a little differently. Not at every broker, not at the whole system, but at that particular layer of it where small companies trade for pennies, where phone calls go out to strangers, where the pressure to buy is always urgent and the pressure to sell never quite arrives. That's where the mob lived for almost a decade, right there, in plain sight. If this story got to you, do me a favor, hit subscribe. We put out a new mob documentary every single week. And drop a comment, who really paid the biggest price in the mob's Wall Street scheme? The investors who lost their money, or the families who lost their structure trying to hide it? I want to hear your take.